The Veth High Consul had not moved in 4 hours, and Taura's left hand had been shaking for 3. She stood in the Grand Conclave of the Veth hierarchical seat and tried to remember everything Ambassador Pell had briefed her on during the transit from Harmon Station. The Veth communicate dominance through stillness. The most powerful entity in a room is always the least visibly animate. Do not interpret their immobility as inattention. Do not interpret it as patience, either. It is, Pell had said, with the careful precision of a woman who had survived 17 first-contact situations, simply what power looks like when it has nowhere it needs to be. There were 60 Veth in the chamber. Taura knew this without counting. The way you know a room has too many people in it before you've seen them all, by the quality of the air, by the slight additional weight of being observed. They were draped across their positions like architectural features, each one motionless, multi-jointed bodies, arranged with the economical precision of something that had been exactly where it was for a very long time. The High Consul, on the raised platform at the chamber's far end, had not so much as shifted its weight in the entire duration of Taura's presence. Its 4 eyes were fixed in her direction with the patient, geological quality of a landmark. The acknowledgement period was supposed to last a minimum of 2 hours. Taura had known this going in. She'd also known that her left hand would give her approximately 40 minutes of controlled stillness before the nerve damage made its opinions known, and that 60 minutes of politely waiting to be noticed was optimistic, and that 2 hours was not a thing her body was going to agree to under any conditions that didn't involve sedation. She'd planned for it. What she hadn't planned for was the junior emissary. He was positioned near the chamber entrance, not low enough to be near Taura, but low enough to watch the door, and when her hand had begun its small, visible trembling at the 43-minute mark, he had produced a gesture so slight she almost missed it. A single rear appendage, extended briefly at an angle she was only able to read because Pell had made her study 200 hours of Veth body language footage in the transit cabin. Lowest caste. The appendage angle was the Veth equivalent of writing it across her forehead. Taura took the full measure of the room in the single sweep she allowed herself. 60 Veth, none of them moving, all of them watching. The junior emissary, with his appendage still at that angle, the observation hanging in the air like a question someone had decided not to voice politely. She spoke. Consul. Her voice came out steady, which surprised her. I am Taura, diplomatic attaché for the Harmon Compact. I bring a trade dispute of Category 7 urgency under the Kethvar Accords, to which the Veth hierarchy is a signatory. I request acknowledgement. Anywen, 2000 W. The sound of her voice in that room was extraordinary. It was the only sound in the room. Every one of those 60 bodies did not react, and the absence of reaction was itself a reaction, the particular quality of attention that 60 motionless creatures can generate when they are all paying it to the same point. The High Consul's left mandible moved. It was the smallest possible motion, a shift of perhaps 3 degrees, but it was movement. In a room where movement was the language of the powerless, and it came from the most powerful creature in the chamber. And Taura filed it away in the careful archive she kept behind her sternum, where she stored the things she didn't yet understand, but suspected she would need. Then 3 junior officials moved to surround her, and she was escorted, with perfect courtesy and 0 warmth, out of the Grand Conclave. She had, she reflected, accomplished exactly what she'd intended, and she had no idea yet whether any of it was going to work. The penitent's chamber had no chair. Taura had been in the diplomatic service for 11 years and had developed strong opinions about rooms that were designed to be uncomfortable as a statement. This one had been thought through with genuine artistry. The floor was smooth and slightly angled, so that standing on it required constant small muscular adjustments. The light came from a source she couldn't locate, and it was set at precisely the wavelength that made the edges of her vision feel slightly uncertain. The temperature was 3 degrees below comfortable. She stood in it for 4 minutes. then sat on the floor. Her left hand was doing its worst at the moment the sustained stillness attempt in the conclave had cost her, and the tremor was running all the way up to her elbow. She pressed it against her thigh and focused on her breathing and thought about Ambassador Pell, who had said, on the subject of nerve damage and diplomatic situations, "The limitation is not the problem, Taura. The problem is always something else. The limitation is just the lens." She was examining this thought when the door opened. The Veth who entered was arranged in a posture she'd catalogued as mid-caste professional, the specific distribution of joint angles that meant this individual had standing, used it regularly, and was currently deploying a subset of it in a context where full display would be unnecessary and possibly rude. He moved with the minimum efficiency of a species that considered movement expensive, crossing the chamber to stand at a careful distance that felt, by human standards, like the distance you'd maintain from a slightly unpredictable weather event. "I am Sethek of the Third," he said. His standard was excellent, better than hers, probably. "I have been assigned to explain your situation." "I appreciate it," Taura said. "Does your assignment extend to finding me a chair?" Sethek of the Third regarded her for a moment. "The penitent's chamber does not contain seating. Discomfort is instructive." "Instructive of what?" Another pause. "The posture of humility." "I see." Taura looked at her left hand, which was delivering its opinion of this conversation with considerable emphasis. "And what have I done that requires me to be humbled?" "You spoke," Sethek said, with the tone of someone identifying a simple and irreversible fact. "In the Grand Conclave, during the acknowledgement period, to the High Consul directly, without having been recognized. This constitutes a declaration of unworthiness. The status is inheritable by the entities you represent." Taura absorbed this. "So my speaking has classified the entire Harmon Compact trade delegation as servant class commerce." "Yes." "And the remedy? You have 48 of your hours to achieve stillness." Sethek's gaze traveled to her left hand, then returned to her face with the careful neutrality of a creature trying to determine which of two things it was looking at. "If you can demonstrate the posture of high caste for one sustained hour, the declaration is suspended pending review." "One sustained hour of complete stillness." "Complete stillness," Sethek confirmed. "No movement. No sound." Taura looked at her hand. Her hand trembled in the light of the badly placed lamp. The tremor, running its small seismic commentary on the subject of asking too much of damaged tissue. And she did not move it. And she did not hide it. And she held Sethek's gaze and said, pleasantly, "That does present some difficulties." "Yes," Sethek said, after a pause that she couldn't entirely read. "I observed." She couldn't tell if he meant the observation as sympathy or as the filing of evidence. She suspected, from the angle of his front appendages, that she might have filed it incorrectly in his hierarchy of data. She filed that too. "Tell me something," she said. "In 400 years of contact with species, unlike your own, and I know you've had it, because the Kethvar Accords are an 8-species document, has any species ever managed this particular demonstration?" Sethek was still for a long moment. "2. The Velhari, who are incapable of voluntary motion during certain metabolic phases, and the Grethken, whose biology produces perfect stillness in conditions of low gravity." He paused. "You are neither." "No," Taura agreed. "I'm something else." She pressed her left hand against her thigh again and looked at the ceiling. "You have 48 hours of watching me try to do something my body can't do, or you have 48 hours of something more interesting. I know which one I'd prefer." Sethek of the Third did not move for a long time after that. But he also did not leave. She had 4 hours until the next formal review, one working hand, and a junior Veth official in a chamber with inadequate lighting, which was she'd worked with less. Sethek had brought her food at the 16-hour mark, something that tasted like pressed mineral salts and had the texture of careful engineering, which she ate because she needed the calories, and because accepting it meant something in Veth social calculus that she was beginning to build a model of. He had sat with her for 3 hours after that, and they had talked, in the careful way of two people, learning each other's grammar, in real time, she asking questions whose answers she half knew, him correcting her half-knowing with the precision of someone who found imprecision physically uncomfortable. She'd been building a picture of the Consul's mandible motion. She was thinking about it when the sound came from below. It was a grinding, a structural complaint. The kind of sound a building makes when something it has been relying on decides to stop being reliable. Taura was on her feet before she'd consciously chosen to be, which was a habit 11 years of field work had installed without asking her permission. She was at the door, which was unlocked. She'd checked that at hour 2, quietly, because she always checked, and into the corridor, following the sound, before Sethek had finished standing. The lower archive was 2 levels down and 3 corridors west, which she knew because she'd memorized the conclave schematic during transit. It was also, when she arrived, partially inaccessible. A support column had come down and taken part of the ceiling with it, and under a section of the resulting debris, there was a young Veth, folded into the particular configuration of a body that has decided the floor is the safest available option. Around the collapsed section, in the corridor and the intact portion of the archive, there were 7 Veth. None of them were moving. Taura understood, in a flash of clarity that felt like cold water, that they were not moving because moving would cost them, and the cost was too high, and the hierarchy that made the cost too high was woven into every part of how they existed. She understood it the way you understand a locked door completely, and without judgment, and with immediate interest in the hinges. She went into the collapsed section. Her left hand failed on the first piece of debris grip, simply not there. Fingers opening when she needed them closed, and she swore, quietly, and used her forearm instead, levering the piece to the side. The young Veth watched her. He was conscious, one arm at an angle that suggested it wasn't supposed to be at that angle, eyes wide, and all 4 of them tracking her movement. "I'm going to get you out," she said, because she'd found that stating intentions clearly tended to reduce the ambient chaos. "This is going to take a moment. Tell me if something I'm about to do is going to hurt you." The young Veth made a sound she hadn't catalogued. "I'll take that as permission," Taura said, and got to work. Her left hand failed twice more. The second time it failed, she lost her grip on a ceiling tile and caught the edge of it across her right forearm, which added a thin line of blood to the proceedings and a specific variety of language that the Conclave's translation systems probably weren't prepared for. She switched approaches, used her body as a brace, and got the main obstruction moved by shoving it with her shoulder while keeping her right hand free for the smaller pieces. "Sethek," she called, because he'd followed her and was standing at the threshold. "I need something rigid, approximately 60 centimeters, to splint this arm. My sash will serve as the binding." Sethek, who had not moved since arriving at the threshold, moved. He crossed to her in 4 steps, which was, she filed this too, a significant number of steps for a Veth of his standing. He handed her something from the wall fixtures. She used it. She talked throughout, narrating what she was doing, because the young Veth's eyes were tracking her face and her voice seemed to be the thing keeping him on the right side of shock. She was, as she worked, absolutely and continuously audible, and she was aware of the 7 Veth in the corridor, and the additional Veth who had arrived during the operation, all of them watching a human make noise and bleed on their archive floor and commit the compound heresy of touching another species' cast member without authorization. She got him out. She was sitting on the floor of the corridor, her back against the intact wall, the young Veth's splinted arm resting across her knee because that had been the least painful configuration, when Sethek crouched beside her. Crouching was, she'd learned, a significant postural commitment for a Veth. It put his eyes at her level. With clicking off, "He is Irith," Sethek said. Junior Archive Cast. Junior Archive Cast. Is he going to be all right? The arm will require treatment. The rest of him is intact. A pause. You are bleeding. I've bled before. She looked at Irith, who had both of his functional hands wrapped around her, shaking left one, and whose touch was, she noticed, completely steady. I've also been yelled at for protocol violations before. I'm guessing we're about to add some more to the count. Yes, Sethek said. He was looking at her left hand, held in Irith's. His body was doing something she'd never seen a Veth body do. We are dumb. He didn't say what it was he was looking at, but he stayed crouched on the floor beside her while the Conclave's medical team arrived, which cost him something she could only estimate, and which she suspected was not nothing. The Consul had moved. Taura knew this before she entered the formal accounting chamber because Sethek had told her, walking her there with an escort she hadn't been given before, and the information had arranged itself in her chest into something that felt like the specific combination of recognition and dread that occurs when you've been watching a storm from a window and the wind finally turns toward you. A moving Consul meant maximum engagement. Maximum engagement meant the formal accounting had been convened at the highest available level, which meant she had approximately 6 minutes, by her estimate, before everything went permanently wrong. The chamber was larger than the Grand Conclave. It had been designed for exactly this kind of occasion. High ceilings, the light placed correctly this time. A kind of austere intention in the architecture that communicated without ambiguity that this was a room where things were decided. The Consul was on the central platform, and it was, for the first time, clearly, visibly present in a way that had not been apparent during the 4 hours of its motionlessness. Some quality of attention had gathered and sharpened. There were other Veth on secondary platforms. She counted 9 high caste. The junior officials who had escorted her out of the Grand Conclave were arranged in a lower tier. Sethek was at the edge of the room. Irith was not present. She'd asked. Sethek had said he was in medical. She'd taken that answer apart twice, looking for reassurance, and had eventually decided to believe it. A high caste official she hadn't been introduced to listed the charges: her speaking, her movement, her unauthorized physical contact with a caste member. Each item was delivered with the precision of something that had been very carefully organized before being presented. And the cumulative weight of them, the declaration of aggression, the implied fleet posture, the trade route reclassification settled into the room with the gravity of a thing that had already been decided and was waiting for the formality to catch up. She was offered the silence of submission. 1 hour. Complete stillness. No sound. If she achieved it, the declaration was reduced to an insult, which was a civil matter. If she failed and her left arm was shaking from the wrist to the shoulder now, the most significant tremor she'd had in 6 months, stress and blood loss, and 3 hours of sleep compounding each other with cheerful efficiency. The declaration stood, and the fleet assets currently repositioning in the outer system would finish repositioning. Taura stood in front of 60 high caste Veth and the Consul, and thought about what she was worst at. She was worst at silence. She had always been worst at silence. She had been told this at 7 years old by a teacher who meant it unkindly, and at 15 by a superior officer who meant it as a liability assessment, and at 22 by a fellow attaché who meant it as a warning. And she had spent her career doing things with the limitation that the people who named it hadn't anticipated, and she was not going to stop now. She looked at the Consul. "What does it mean?" she said, into the absolute silence of the chamber. "When you moved your mandible in the first hour of my arrival, I filed it. I'd like to understand what I saw." The silence after she spoke was different from the silence before it. It had texture. It had the particular quality of 60 people who have just watched someone do the thing that cannot be done and have not yet recalibrated to include it as a real event. The Consul looked at her. It was, she had decided, not looking away from her. It had not looked away from her since she'd entered the room. She held its gaze and did not hide her shaking arm, and waited. That question, said the High Consul of the Veth hierarchical seat, in a voice that had the quality of geological formations changing their minds, is not in the script of this proceeding. No, Taura agreed. I know. You noticed, the Consul said. The formal accounting had not resumed. The 9 high caste officials on the secondary platforms had arranged themselves in a configuration Taura was fairly sure signified confusion, which was a configuration she'd never seen in any of the footage Pell had shown her, and which she was storing carefully. Sethek had moved to a position closer to the central platform, which was also not in the footage. I noticed, Taura confirmed. 3 degrees. Left mandible. 47 minutes into the acknowledgement period. You were the most still thing in the room. It was the only motion. The Consul was quiet for long enough that she began counting her own heartbeats. Irith, the Consul said finally, was my ward. 3rd-generation ward of my household line. I had been informed incorrectly, end quote, as it was subsequently determined that he had been caught in the collapse. The information arrived during your acknowledgement period. A pause, in which Taura reassembled everything she thought she knew about the past 36 hours. To move was to demote myself. The hierarchy does not make exceptions for, the Consul stopped. For grief, Taura said. The Consul's mandible moved again. Same 3 degrees. Same direction. She understood, now, what she was looking at. She understood it with the specific and terrible clarity of recognizing a familiar pain in a body that is not your own. No, the Consul said. The hierarchy does not make exceptions. Taura sat down on the floor of the formal accounting chamber, which was probably not sanctioned, and thought for a moment about all the things that hierarchies did not make exceptions for, and all the things that remained true anyway. Her left hand was in her lap. She stopped trying to hold it still. I want to propose a reclassification, she said. Not of the trade status, of the declaration itself. The 9 high caste officials conferred in the way that creatures confer when they can only do it in small, controlled movements. A shifting of appendage angles. A redistribution of joint tension. She was reading approximately 40% of it and guessing the other 60. You have made a declaration of aggression, the official who'd listed the charges said. The Veth have a category, Taura said, called Challenge of Understanding. I looked it up in the Kethvar supplementary records. It hasn't been invoked in 400 years, but it's in there. It requires both parties to remain in contact until comprehension is achieved. I'm proposing that's what this is. More conferring. The criteria for Challenge of Understanding, Sethek said, from his position near the central platform, and she noticed that he was speaking, which was either an enormous breach of his own protocol or a signal that the rules had shifted when she wasn't watching, require that the challenging party demonstrate genuine incomprehension rather than bad faith or incompetence. I broke your protocols, Taura said. Every one of them. I was loud. I moved. I touched someone without permission. I spoke when silence was required. And then, when you gave me the chance to fix it with silence, I spoke again. She looked at the Consul. Does that look like incompetence to you? Or does it look like someone who doesn't understand why the protocols exist? The Consul's 4 eyes moved, individually, to 4 different points in the room. She didn't know what that meant. She filed it. I saved your ward, she said, more quietly. Not because I calculated the political value, not because I was making a point, because he was under the rubble and I was not, and in my species that means you go in. I don't know how to explain that to you. I genuinely don't understand how to exist in a hierarchy that doesn't include that. She paused. That seems like comprehension that hasn't been achieved. The room held its position. Then the Consul said, sit with me. Taura looked at Sethek, who made a small movement she'd learned to read as proceed, and she crossed the chamber and climbed to the Consul's platform, which was probably also not sanctioned, and sat beside the largest, most powerful, most carefully motionless creature she had ever been in a room with. And the consul said nothing, and she said nothing, and the chamber did not erupt, which she took as a positive signal. Her hand shook. She watched it shake. She had spent 11 years accommodating it, working around it, occasionally using it as a deliberate signal, a tell she controlled, rather than one that controlled her. She had never, in 11 years of field work, sat somewhere and simply let it shake without any accompanying strategy. The consul looked at it for a long time. Movement, the consul said, in our physiology, is involuntary under only one condition. Taura waited. Loss, the consul said. She understood what it was offering her. She thought about the mandible. She thought about the archive floor, and Irith's hands holding hers steady, and the thing she'd seen in Sethek's body language that she hadn't had a word for until this moment. For us, she said carefully, some movement is involuntary because the body is trying and failing to do something the nervous system asked it to do. She looked at her hand. The system still sends the signal. The muscles receive it imperfectly. The intention is real. The execution is approximate. The intention is real, the consul repeated. The quality of its attention had changed, the way a room changes when a window is opened. You move toward things. Always, she said, loudly and with poor grip. But yes, and your hierarchy does not penalize the movement. My hierarchy, she said, has very complicated feelings about it, and they're mostly wrong, and I've been arguing with them for 11 years. She paused. We're better at the arguing than the arriving, as a species. But we do eventually get there. The consul's posture shifted not much, by the standard of what she'd catalogued in the footage. But the footage had not prepared her for the experience of being in the same space as the shift, of feeling the change in a room that had been stone. She realized, with the particular shock of recognizing a joke you've been missing for the whole conversation, that what she was seeing was the consul trying something. Stillness, the consul said, is not the absence of feeling. It is the proof that you trust the world to hold what you have placed in it. Taura sat with that for a while. I don't trust the world to hold things, she said finally. I trust people. Specifically. After evidence. And have you found it to hold? Sometimes, she said. When it doesn't, I go back in. That's what I do instead. Another silence. Longer. With a different texture. The 9 officials had descended from their platforms at some point during the conversation. She'd registered it peripherally and not interrupted herself to address it. Sethek was still there. The declaration, the consul said, is reclassified. Challenge of understanding. To be resolved through sustained contact between the Harmon Compact and the Veth hierarchy. A pause. Minimum duration. 1 of your years. Done, Taura said, without checking with anyone. Because she knew what Pell would say, and she knew what the compact needed, and she knew how much a trade route upgrade was worth, and also because she would have said done regardless. I'll need better quarters than the penitent's chamber. Yes, the consul said, with a slight movement she was cataloging as the Veth equivalent of dry. You will. You will. She sat on the platform for 20 minutes after that. She had the impression that the consul was doing something analogous to what she was doing, which was being present in the aftermath of a thing without immediately converting it into a next action. It was not, for either of them, a natural state. She suspected that was why neither of them moved to end it. Her hand shook the whole time. The consul did not look away from it once. She thought about what Pell had said about limitations being lenses, and about what the consul had said about the world holding what you placed in it, and about Irith on the archive floor holding her shaking hand with both of his, steady while she was not, and she thought that the true problem with limitations was never what they stopped you doing. It was that they took 11 years to stop being a secret. Sethek walked her out when it was over. He fell into step beside her at a distance that was not the distance of professional courtesy, but the closer distance of something they'd have to develop a word for, and they walked through the corridors of the Veth Conclave, while the light came through the high windows at the angle of a late afternoon on a world that was not hers, and she could feel the building around her as a place that now had a room in it she'd been in, which changed its character completely. At the outer door, Sethek stopped. "The trade route reclassification," he said, "will require 6 months of technical review. I will be the Veth contact for that process." "Good," she said. "I'll need someone who knows when I'm getting the grammar wrong." "Frequently," he said, with the slight appendage shift she'd categorized as dry, and then reconsidered, and updated to something closer to fond. She stepped through the outer door into the light of the Veth city, which was enormous and angular, and built by something that moved as little as possible, and she could feel her left hand shaking at her side, and for the first time in 11 years, she didn't put it in her pocket. She let it shake in the light, and walked toward the next thing.